Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick.
I'm Ian.
Today we're talking about some of our favorite and most essential metal albums. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you go check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that we put together every week, and of course the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a little thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time we release new episodes. So I guess to be completely transparent, metal is a genre that I've never been a big fan of. There are some great albums over the years. Obviously, I've got a lot of Metallica, Sabbath, things like that. But over the last couple of years, last few years, I've been getting more and more into metal. You're somebody that's always loved
I've
metal.
liked metal, but I don't like new metal. And there's a lot of even like slightly pre-new metal that I really don't like. I have to say I'm probably more of like the 80s and early 90s or late 70s through the early 90s metal that I prefer. I'm open to all the newer stuff, but a lot of it just doesn't appeal to me.
Yeah.
But as a rule, like I said, that late 70s to the mid 90s metal is what I really dig.
And it's funny, over the last couple of years, as I've gone back and started listening to a lot of like older metal, it's funny because I remember a lot of this stuff listening to it at your house back in the 90s, but I just hadn't listened to it in so long, I'd just kind of forgotten about it. So we're going to go over kind of what we think are like the essential metal albums. But drop us a comment down below. Make sure you let us know what your favorite or really essential metal albums are.
Because there will be a lot of them.
I'm sure that this album could have been, I mean, this video could have been 30 minutes long. There's so many albums we could have included in here. But
30 minutes, tries like 4 hours.
But the one I had to have in here, it's definitely an album that, I've loved since probably the late 80s when I first started listening to this band. The album is Master of Puppets by Metallica. I got into Metallica when the video for One came out off of Injustice for All. And it was probably around the time that the Black Album came out that I started really kind of going back through. Listening to their first couple of albums, I discovered Master of Puppets and instantly fell in love with this album. You know, from beginning to end, it's just packed full of hits. And, it's funny to see it in Stranger Things, and now people are in the 2020s are rediscovering this album all over again.
Yeah, for me, I got Ride the Lightning first, but it was after this came out and before One, and I liked it. It wasn't like, oh, this is the best album I've heard, but I liked it. But I got this as a result of having Ride the Lightning, and this blew me away. I loved this album from the beginning, to the point where it took me a long time to even go back and listen to Ride the Lightning.
Yeah.
So I can totally agree with that. And I think overall, as far as essential albums go, it might be a toss-up between that and Justice for All, but I think Nick and I agree that this is a better album.
Yeah, overall.
Yeah. So for the first one that I have, I will confess that I like this band a lot, but I'm not so familiar with their catalog that I can really pinpoint that this specific album is their contribution to essential metal. But I feel that it is because it does. I think this was one of their more early popular albums.
Yeah.
And it's British Steel by Judas Priest. I like this album a lot. And I even liked this back in the day, but I've really come to appreciate it more now. And it's actually made me want to get more into the band than I ever was. But I mean, this got Breaking the Law. And that was kind of the first song I think any of us had heard that are a little younger than when they first came out.
Beavis and Butthead really kind of helped push this album out.
And I remember seeing the
Breaking
Breaking the Law
90s.
video when I was like little on MTV, but it always stood out to me. So this was kind of the one album of theirs that I was always really familiar with.
Yeah, and I think it's the only Judas Priest album I think I've ever sat down and listened to the entire album.
Well, I've listened to a bunch of them, but I just never really sat down and listened like I have with this one. So I think this is an essential album, and I mean, I think in their catalog, this would probably qualify. People out there might think, no, it was an album that came before, an album that came after. Yeah. I mean, Painkiller is a hugely popular album, but that came much later. So, I don't know. I think British Steel really stands out for me.
An album that a lot of people probably wouldn't think of as being an essential metal album, but this album really helped change metal, at least in the mainstream in the 90s. And I think it's a fantastic album. And it's a vulgar display of power by Pantera, and just a bunch of great songs on here. But like I said, like in the mainstream, This, of course, Pantera was doing, actually in the late 80s, they were doing like hair metal kind of stuff. But even Pantera even changed in the early part of the 90s. And the success of this album, I think, is why you had, bands like Korn and a lot of other new metal stuff that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think you can kind of trace right back to this album.
I agree. I think this is at that transitional point where metal was becoming. I mean, you always had the darker side of metal. That was definitely darker than the hair metal that you had.
Yeah.
But this was kind of taking it to the next level, kind of upping the darkness and the heaviness. Really, there was a lot more. It was heavier. It was dirtier. And it was. I think this definitely was at that transitional period for metal.
Personally, I think I like Far Beyond Driven as better overall as an album, but this is the one I would say is like an essential album to have.
So for my next one, this would probably definitely not be what people would consider from this group to be essential metal, or maybe they would, but it wouldn't be the first one they go to.
Yeah.
And let me just show you what it is. It's Dehumanizer by Black Sabbath. Came out in 1992. The reason I picked this one is because it is essential for two parts. It was Sabbath kind of coming back together in a sense, because a lot of the albums that they released in the 80s a lot of them were good. No,
I think they're bad, but
I'm
not a fan of a lot of their 80s
I like
stuff,
the Tony Martin era more than the other stuff, but and Glenn Hughes I like.
I guess that's true. I do like the Tony Martin albums.
But it was Sabbath kind of coming back together. I mean, you had Bill Ward, you had Geezer Butler, and you had Tony Iommi back, and you had Dio back. And this was the Dio hadn't been with the band since 82, 83, I think.
When Mob Rules came out.
And even though all these songs were recorded with Tony Martin, and Dio came in after the fact and just added his flair to it, it's still, I feel it's just as complete of an album as Heaven and Hell. But again, this is kind of at that transitional period we were talking about with metal with Pantera, because it was Sabbath kind of transitioning to kind of back to where their basic elements.
Yeah.
And
it was definitely less experimental.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's some experimental stuff, but it was definitely, it was a Sabbath album. It was a Dio Sabbath album. And the popularity of this album, I think, really kind of helped to keep Sabbath in that wavelength, which led to the Ozzy reunions that happened in the late 90s, and them being on like Ozfest and stuff like that. Plus, I mean, they had some singles off this album, but that's why I think it's transitional, not just for them, but kind of in part for that metal era.
I can see that.
Yeah.
Sticking with Sabbath, with the next album, this is kind of, I think, the album that most people probably go to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is Paranoid. It's long been my favorite Black Sabbath album. I remember when I was probably 7 or 8 years old, stealing my dad's copy of this and listening to the record over and over again. This was my introduction into Black Sabbath. It'll probably always be my favorite Black Sabbath album. And it's an album that, I still listen to pretty regularly. I think if you look on lists of like the top 10 metal albums,
this is probably
it's always on. Yeah. It's always at least in the top 10. And one that I think it's kind of funny. We were actually talking about this probably within the last year or so, that you didn't understand what the meaning of the album cover was on this also, because so the Paranoid was originally called War Pigs, and that's where the idea of the guy with the sword came from. But they changed the label. The label thought that Paranoid would work better as a single and the album title, so they changed the title, but didn't change the artwork on there. So that's why you got the little guy with the sword on there.
Yeah, and the trails.
Yeah.
I definitely more of I wouldn't say an essential metal album, because one could argue that the Black Sabbath's first album, their self-titled album, and Paranoid were really the first heavy metal albums ever anyway. I mean, arguably.
At least in the mainstream.
Yeah. Well, I can't think of any album.
I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Maybe Arthur Brown.
I'm sure
borderline.
I'm sure there's probably some like underground stuff going on,
but yeah, no. As far as like metal, I mean, they're now classified as doom metal because you have to subcategorize everything.
Yeah.
But
we did a whole episode.
We did a whole episode on it. Yeah. But I could have just as easily have gone with any early Black Sabbath album over Dehumanizer, but I knew that Nick would probably pick this one because he likes Paranoid a little bit better than I do in their catalog.
Yeah.
And I mean, not much can be said that hasn't already been said.
You can't go wrong with this album.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last one I have is another situation where other albums in the band's catalog might be considered more essential or influential, but this is my album. This is the album that got me into the band. And there's also, I want to point out, there's a theme to the albums that I picked. They're all British metal, because I think, as I said, 76 to say 95. Metal was really, aside from the hair stuff that was really popular,
it was mainly British.
It was mostly British metal that was, dominating.
Yeah.
But it's my last choice here is Somewhere in Time by Iron Maiden. I know this is a popular album amongst the fans, but there's other albums that might be considered slightly more influential. Number of the Beast or, Power Slave. Power Slave specifically would probably be considered a more influential album.
Yeah.
But I like this one, and I bought it. I'd heard Iron Maiden, but I didn't really know Iron Maiden because I bought this when I was on cassette, 8 years old. I bought it for the cover because the artwork is. I mean, I can look at that. That is
you can't
artwork.
Can't beat Iron Maiden's artwork.
No, and that is. I mean, Power Slave's got a great album cover, but this one, the album cover sold it for me, and luckily the music followed suit. I really enjoy this album. To this day, I think this is still my favorite Iron Maiden album. It's a toss-up once in a while, depending on my mood, but as a rule, I would always say, if I'm not sure, I'm going to go with Somewhere in Time. 1986 is when it came out.
I'll say that this is one of those albums where it's, when it just comes to album artwork, it's so much better to have the big LP version of this over a CD or even cassette.
Especially cassette.
Of course, over streaming, because you can't really look at anything. Because the back cover of this, I don't know, get a little closer so you can actually see it.
It's so detailed.
It's so detailed. You can spend probably half an hour just looking at this thing, and just the more you look at it, the more really cool stuff you see on it.
Yeah, the band is in there on the back. Eddie's the focus on the front, Cyborg Eddie, and he's always been my favorite incarnation of Eddie too. But yeah, this, like I said, the music follows suit. I love every song on this album. It's probably my number one favorite Iron Maiden album.
Yeah. And then last is an album that I think is the most recent album of any of our picks today. And really, if it wasn't for the other albums on this band wouldn't be here. And this album wouldn't exist. And it's an album that I'm really more of a fan of just this band's first two albums. But their first album in particular is one that I listened to, and I have listened to a bunch of times since it was first released back in 1994. But as the debut album from Korn, this was the album I think that really kind of jump-started the new metal stuff that ended up coming out after this. But and this, I know you're not a Korn fan.
I'm not a
Korn
Korn
new metal
fan. No.
But
it's, I'm familiar with songs on this album. And I don't hate them. I mean, it's not like I like Creed, or whatever. But it doesn't catch me. It doesn't relate to me in any way.
But it's an album that I bought it when it first came out, listened to a bunch, and then, like I said, their second album was almost as good. But after that, I kind of lost interest in a lot of their stuff. But man, this first album though, absolutely killer.
I will point out Jonathan Davis, I think is the lead singer. He did the soundtrack to the Anne Rice's Queen of the Damned movie. The soundtrack's not bad. So, I mean, musically, I can relate to some of the stuff that he's done. It is slightly different than what he's doing here, though, too. So, for what it's worth, I don't hate the album. But I would definitely agree that it's essential because, as you pointed out, it is literally into that transition of new metal.
Well, that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop us a comment down below. Let us know what you guys think. Like I said, we could have done a lot more albums than just these 7, because there's a bunch that are, kind of essential metal albums to own. But let us know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give us the thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And that's all we got. Until next time.
Talk to y'all later.
Keep on spinning. Peace.